Section 0 of Anecdotes of Great Musicians by Willey Gates. Introductory. In the search for what this volume comprises, much material has been examined. Had the intention been to make it include all the anecdotes that are related of various musicians, 3 times the present space would have been necessary. But many of the narratives of past and current literature will not stand the test of probability, and in some cases the humor or reason for relation is hard to find. I have attempted to call from the mass of material that came to my notice such anecdotes as have 2 features, that of being characteristic of the person referred to, and that of possessing sufficient interest, and in this re-narration I have incorporated such bits of musical information along biographical and historical lines as came to mind at the time of writing, but letting this feature be secondary to the main idea of the work. Thus it is hoped that while my readers may find interesting anecdote, they may also incidentally find that which is of more permanent value. This work may be regarded as a companion volume to my musical mosaics, supplementing the thoughts of the great musicians there expressed with incidents giving somewhat of a clue to their personality. It would be in vain for me to attempt to acknowledge all the sources from which these anecdotes have been gleaned, owing to the extent of the field covered. The majority of the matter appears in this volume for the first time in its present form, although in a few cases there are partial quotations. No classification has been made in the body of the work, thus avoiding monotony in a consecutive reading. The indexes furnish ample references. If these narrations awaken a more general interest in musical biography, one purpose of my labor will have been accomplished. W. Francis Gates. End of Section 0. Read by Carrie Adams, your book voice, at Mesa, Arizona, on the 21st of November, 2022. Section 1 of Anecdotes of Great Musicians by Willey Gates. 1. The Gregorian Chant. There have been musical antagonisms in all ages of the world. Church and state have joined in them as well as individuals, but not all of them had as judicious an arbiter as had the dispute between the French and Roman singers on the occasion of a visit of Charlemagne to Rome to celebrate Holy Week about the year 803 A.D. This most Catholic magnate had taken with him his choir, and the Gallic singers soon started a controversy with the choristers of the Roman Church, claiming to sing better and more agreeably than the Italians. But the Roman choristers knew that their style of music was in direct descent from St. Gregory, and accused the Gauls of corrupting and disfiguring the true ecclesiastical style. Finally, this dispute between the singers of the good King Charles and those of Pope Adrian waxed so warm that the king thought it time to take a hand and end the hostilities. He called his singers before him and asked them whether they thought the water of a fountain would be purest at its source, or after it had run a good distance and had been mixed with other streams. Of course, they answered that the nearer to the source, the purer the water. The king then exclaimed, Mount ye then up to the pure fountain of St. Gregory, whose chant ye have manifestly corrupted. On his return to France, Charlemagne took with him, at his request, and by the appointment of Pope Adrian, 2 singers learned in the true ecclesiastical mode. He stationed one at Metz and the other at Soissons. The Pope also sent choral books, which had been written by Gregory, so that these teachers, who had themselves studied under him, could correct the French books. The king ordered all singing masters in the kingdom to be taught by these Roman monks, and to conform their books and teaching to the Gregorian antiphonal. 2. The Bach Revival. One of Mendelssohn's ardent friends in his youthful days was Edward Devrient, a thorough musician and an excellent singer. These friends used to delve into the music of old Bach and revel in the learning displayed there. One day they resolved to take up the old cantor's passion music, which had not been heard for 100 years, and which was, even to such good musicians as they, known by name only. They became enchanted with the beauties of this lofty masterpiece, and Devrient enthusiastically declared it ought to be given in public. Mendelssohn at first ridiculed the suggestion, saying the public would not give it a cordial reception, and that it was sure to be a failure. But after talking it over, Mendelssohn became as enthusiastic on the subject as was his friend. So the 2 young fellows, for Mendelssohn was then only 18, went to see Zelter, Mendelssohn's teacher, the most influential musician in Berlin. After considerable argument, they convinced Zelter of the feasibility of their plan, and, securing his promise of cooperation, went home to begin the arduous labors that such a performance entails on manager and conductor. They had to secure the soloists, the double chorus, and the double orchestra demanded by the score. Devrient himself sang the part allotted to Christ, and Mendelssohn conducted. It is needless to say that the performance, given in 1829, was a success. A repetition was demanded, and not Berlin alone, but the whole musical world began to realize that in Sebastian Bach's great works there was a mine of wealth that would be unexhausted for ages. And it was to these young men, Mendelssohn especially, that we owe our knowledge and appreciation of the Leipzig cantor's masterwork of sacred music. But Mendelssohn did not stop with this. Through his efforts, there was erected a fine monument to Bach's memory, which perpetuates the face and figure of this fountainhead of modern music. It was erected in 1842 in front of the Thomas Schule, in which Bach taught, and facing the windows of his study. 3. Why we should sing. It is generally admitted that there is a beneficial physiological side to the matter of singing, as well as that of entertainment and musical pleasure. Long and learned articles on this subject come from erudite pens, but we venture that it would be hard to find anything more unique in this line than the reasons briefly set down by the author to persuade everyone to learn to sing, given in William Byrd's Psalms, Sonnets, and Songs of Sadness and Piety, published in England in 1588. These reasons that are briefly set down are as follows. First, it is a knowledge easily taught and quickly learned when there is a good master and an apt scholar. 2. The exercise of singing is delightful to nature, and good to preserve the health of man. 3. It doth strengthen all parts of the breast, and doth open the pipes. 4. It is a singular good remedy for a stutting and stammering in the speech. 5. It is the best means to procure a perfect pronunciation, and to make a good orator. 6. It is the only way to know when nature hath bestowed the benefit of a good voice, which gift is so rare as there is not one among 1,000 that hath it, and in many that excellent gift is lost because they want art to express nature. 7. There is not any music of instruments whatsoever comparable to that which is made of the voices of men, for the voices are good, and the same well sorted and ordered. 8. The better the voice is, the meeter it is to honor and serve God therewith, and the voice of man is chiefly to be employed to that end. Since singing is so good a thing, I wish all men would learn to sing. 4. Glimpses of Cherubini. Cherubini was a gruff old fellow, but occasionally a bit of kindness or humor came to the surface, and then he showed the better side of his nature. He was one day met at the Paris Conservatoire, of which he was the head, by a father who came bringing his talented son to gain admission to the institution. Cherubini exclaimed when the man had told his errand, "What do you want? I do not take infants to nurse." The father was about to give up his attempt, but was told to take the boy to a certain room and have him play whatever he could think of, and not to stop when Cherubini came into the room. Soon the director came in. Hearing the boy play, he was astonished at the talent and youth of the performer, and proceeded to question him on the principles of music. The result was that he at once admitted the boy to the conservatoire. Cherubini afterward, in telling others about the affair, said, "I had to be very careful about pushing the questions too far, for the baby was beginning to prove to me that he knew more about music than I do myself." When Berlioz was a student in the conservatoire, he was generally at sword's points with the crusty director. Once, on examination day, Cherubini was running over a piece which Berlioz had submitted, when he came upon a complete rest of 2 measures. "What is that?" he asked in his usual ill-natured tone. "Mr. Director," said the pupil, "I wish to produce an effect which I thought could best be produced by silence." "Ah, you thought it would produce a good effect upon the audience if you suppressed 2 measures?" "Yes, sir." "Very good. Suppress the rest. The effect will be better still." As an instance of Cherubini's curt wit, the following little conversation is cited. One day a friend handed a score to Cherubini, saying it was by Mihul. After looking it over, he exclaimed, "It is not Mihul's. It is too bad to be his." "Then will you believe me if I tell you that it is mine?" said the visitor. And Cherubini replied, "No, it is too good to be yours." 5. Discovering a Nightingale. Many years ago, in 1827, there lived in an almshouse in the old city of Stockholm a little 6-year-old girl who had been put in charge of an old woman who, by the way, was none too kind to the orphan in her care. When her guardian went out to earn her daily pittance, This little maid was locked in the house to prevent her wandering about, and so the lonesome little Joanne was deprived of the bright sunshine and the sight of the beautiful trees and flowers so beloved by every Swedish heart. One day she had worked over the little tasks assigned her until she was tired, and oh, how she longed to get out into the open air. But no, the door was locked. No wonder she poured out her childish grief in tears. Soon her sole companion caught her eye, and taking up her half-starved pussy, she rocked her pet until they both fell asleep. When she awoke, the sun had gone well down. Fearing the scolding she was sure to get when the old dame came home, the child caught up her work and began to sing in a sweet voice that seemed far too old for a girl her age. While she went on with her singing, it happened that a lady of high rank was passing the house, and so struck was she by the clear, sweet tones that she stopped her carriage to listen. On caroled the little songstress, perfectly unconscious of her audience, till she was startled by a knock at the door. She could not open it, but some kind neighbor told the fair visitor about the little prisoner. The kind-hearted lady came back afterward and secured the child admission to a school and later to the Royal Theatre classes. As the girl grew older, her talent developed until, as the Swedish nightingale, she was known the world over. Did you recognize in her Jenny Lind? End of section 1. Read by Carrie Adams, your book boys, at Mesa, Arizona, on the 2nd of December, 2022.
Section 2 of Anecdotes of Great Musicians. Read by Sonia. Anecdotes of Great Musicians by Willey Francis Gates. 6. Balf's Strange Roommate. The composer of the popular Bohemian Girl once had an experience that he did not care to duplicate. Landladies are not supposed to be very sentimental beings, at least toward their lodgers, but have the reputation of being businesslike and matter-of-fact. But the one who caused this peculiar occurrence, in which Balfe was an interested party, certainly stood at the head of the procession in her delight in silver rather than sentiment. Balfe and other musicians were engaged for a short time in some musical doings on the outskirts of London, and rather than go back and forth from the city each day, they decided to take rooms for the time in that neighbourhood. But apartments were scarce, and the genial Irishman was compelled to take what offered at a house not any too prepossessing in its external appearance. It was quite late. The landlady was uncertain whether there were any spare rooms or not, but left him standing in the hallway while she went to see if she could arrange a room for him. Finally she returned, and told him in a confused way that his apartment was ready. Tired by the day's labour, he soon fell asleep without examining the room, but early the next morning proceeded to make a tour of his apartment. He had not gone far before he discovered in a closet opening from his room a corpse, which had evidently been put in its cramped quarters in great haste. Balfe stopped not on the order of his going, but took his departure, thankful, however, that he had not made the discovery in the moonlight of the night before. The old lady had evidently been unable to withstand the temptation to make a little ready cash, and summarily deprived the body of her deceased relative of its temporary resting-place, and Balfe had calmly stepped in and taken its place. He used to joke over the landlady's eye to business, but that experience so impressed him that he never occupied a strange room without making an examination prior to sleeping in it. 7. Berlioz and Paganini. Berlioz was no exception to the majority of composers in the matter of finances. In fact, it was a continual struggle for him to keep the pot boiling, and he could only do so by his literary work. But his genius and need were recognized in other quarters. he gave a concert in which he conducted his great Childe Harold symphony and achieved much success. After the concert, when the composer had sat down to rest, there came to him a tall, dark man, thin as a skeleton, and kneeling down before the whole orchestra, he kissed Berlioz's hand. It was Paganini. The next morning Paganini's son brought to Berlioz a letter, saying, "Papa wants you not to read this letter until you are alone." And then the little fellow vanished. When Berlioz opened the letter, he found it to be from Paganini, saying that, Beethoven being dead, Berlioz alone could revive him, and asked Berlioz to accept the enclosure as Paganini's homage to his greatness. The enclosure was an order on the firm of Rothschild for 20,000 francs. Berlioz was delighted with this princely gift, and wrote and tore up 4 letters before he could get one that would sufficiently express his thanks. The 800 pounds served him a good turn, even if he never found out that it was not out of Paganini's pocketbook. He had the money, and the violinist the credit of giving it. 8. History repeats itself. This old saying is particularly true of musical anecdote and story. Of course, it must be that history really does repeat itself, for certainly no one could be so heartless as to charge the enterprising manager or the penny-a-liner sadly in need of copy with hunting among old tales for one to apply to modern favorites. Munsey's Magazine for December 93 gives the following incident. A touching incident is recorded among the experiences of Madame Melba, now singing in New York, last year at Palermo. It was during a performance of Lucia. The diva was changing her costume between the acts when a lady appeared in her dressing-room. After complimenting her on her singing, the stranger took up in one hand some strands of Madame Melba's hair, which was flowing loose over her shoulders, and asked, "Is this all your own?" Upon being satisfied on this point, the visitor continued, "Allow me, Madame Melba, since I have no wreath of flowers to offer you, to twine you one with your own beautiful tresses." This she did, trilling a bar or two of music meanwhile, for the visitor was none other than Christine Nilsson. It seemed to me that the above incident had about it the flavour of antiquity, and turning to an English work published several years ago, I find the following. On the occasion of her second visit to Naples in 1835, an incident occurred which afforded Madame Persiani deep gratification. During the representation of Lucia, she was one evening changing her costume between the acts when a lady entered her dressing-room, and after a few general compliments on her singing, took in her hands the long fair tresses which floated in wild profusion over the shoulders of the cantatrice, asking if they were really her own. Madame Persiani laughingly invited her to satisfy herself on this point, when the visitor said with a smile, "Allow me, signora, since I have no wreath of flowers to offer you, to twine you one with your own beautiful tresses," and she did so. Madame Persiani's heart beat with pride and joy, for it was Malibran, the greatest singer of the day, who spoke. 9. The greatest musical prodigy. The receipt from London of a musical work edited many years ago by Dr. William Crotch calls to mind the fact that nowhere do we find record of a more remarkable exhibition of musical genius in a mere baby than in the case of this same person in his early years. He was born in 1775, and when but 2 years of age showed a great enjoyment in music, and could pick out on the organ keys such tunes as God Save the King. He would also play little melodies of his own, supplying them with a simple but correct harmony. He played before the king, royal family, and other titled personages of England, and was greeted with admiring wonder wherever his talents were displayed by his proud parents. At the age of 4 years he had frequently appeared in public. He could name any tone heard by him, and took great delight in pleasant harmonies, though he could not hear a discord without expressing disgust. Mozart was, in his youth, a great prodigy, but his genius was not of so early development as that of little William Crotch. Mozart became one of the greatest composers, but Crotch, though he was granted the degree of Doctor of Music in 1799 by Oxford University, and though regarded as a great musician in his day, is now almost unknown to the musical world. 10. A test of precocity. The youthful Mozart was not the greatest prodigy known to history, but he was one of the few whose early precocity did not lead to expectations which were disappointed in later life. His musical life was a continual growth. Great stories were told of his marvelous abilities, and some of them were doubtless exaggerated. But every claim that was put forth by himself or by the parents of this wonder child he could fulfill. The Archbishop of Salzburg had it in his power to benefit the art of all succeeding time by granting proper patronage to Mozart, but this the churlish old fellow declined to do. He even declared that the boy Mozart was a fraud, and in the interests of art and religion he would unmask him. His plan was to confine the young genius in a closed room, give him pens, ink, paper, and the necessary words, and to hold him prisoner there until he should have composed a mass. The Mozarts, father and son, consented to the trial, knowing it was entirely within the boy's powers. For more than a week did he stay in that room, seeing no one save the servant who brought his meals. At the end of this time he sent to the bishop his composition, which, after trial by the court band, the bishop ordered to be placed in the repertoire of the cathedral choir. But even after this display of genius, the prelate was lacking in that appreciation of art which would have led him to become a beneficent patron. End of section 2. Section 3 of Anecdotes of Great Musicians by Willey Francis Gates. 11. Irish Enthusiasm. On the last night of her series of performances at Dublin in 1868, Mademoiselle Tietjens was the recipient of such an ovation as is seldom given even to those petted beings, operatic prime donne. At the close of the aria, Ocean, thou mighty monster, in Weber's Oberon, the audience rose en masse, some calling for a repetition, and others for favourite Irish songs. The uproar continued for 10 or 15 minutes before quiet could be restored, and then the diva decided to sing the favourite, Last Rose of Summer. But the orchestra had no music for the song, and a further delay ensued. Finally, Signor Bettini was seen pushing a small piano out on the stage, and meanwhile Tietjens assisted the conductor to climb up out of the orchestra. In turning the piano around, the slant of the stage caused it to tip over. Now behind the wings were the rest of the company, waiting to go on with the next scene. Among them were several attired as demons. On the upsetting of the piano, out rushed half a dozen devils to set things straight, an unusual occupation for the satanic brood. Again silence was secured, and this time Tietjens finished her song. At its close the uproarious applause was again indulged in. But after the opera came the climax. The crowd of students who had filled the gallery hastened to the stage entrance, cut the traces of her carriage, and tied in their places 2 long ropes. These were grasped by 2 files of shouting students. The prima donna entered her carriage, and was in this way escorted down the street, the crowd continually being augmented by new arrivals. Several had supplied themselves with fireworks, and the whole thing had the effect of a triumphal procession. When the strings of volunteer horses arrived at a corner, owing to there being no agreement concerning the route, one set turned one way and the other in an opposite direction. The result was that the carriage containing Tietjens and her escorts came to a sudden and forcible stop against a building. But after some parley, both teams agreed to unite on the same direction. When finally they arrived at her hotel, the enthusiastic students threw their coats on the pavement from the carriage to the doorway, over which the diva passed to her rooms. The crowd remained around the hotel for over an hour, making continual calls for a song, and their numbers were so great that the police were unable to disperse them. Though Tietjens darkened her rooms to give the impression that she had gone to bed, still they remained. Finally a police official came up and said that unless Madame would assist in dispersing the crowd, the consequences might be disastrous. So Tietjens consented to try. She went to her window and motioned for silence. Then addressing the crowd, she said, "I will sing you the Last Rose of Summer, providing you will promise to go home at once and be as quiet as mice." Then, a second time for that evening, did she sing the old song, and to the surprise of the people in the hotel, the mob melted away like magic, without another sound. The police official declared that if ever a mob broke out in Ireland, he should send for Mademoiselle Titians as the person who would most probably be successful in quelling it. The manager, Colonel Mapleson, and the prima donna had to pay well for the enthusiasm of their admirers, for the jolly Irishmen forgot to return the horses they took from the carriage, and the owner sent the bill to the manager. 12. Playing like zwei Gotts. The Pachmann, the pianist, is so full of whimsicalities, of grimaces, and odd doings, and withal is such a superb player, that he has been characterized by one epigrammatic writer as having the soul of an angel in the body of an ape, and by another as a combination of specialized wisdom and undifferentiated damnfoolism. An instance of this latter element of his character took place after a recent recital of his in New York. A pianist of some note went on the stage to congratulate him on his brilliant performance. He found the Pachmann pacing up and down the stage, exclaiming in fury, "Ach Gott, these American peoples, how they do! They know not music. I will go back to my Germany. Here they know nothings. I play like one Gott, and what they do." Taking his hand, the visitor tried to assuage his wrath by saying, "Yes, yes, Mr. Pachmann, you did play like a god." Whereupon the irrepressible combination of egotism and genius burst forth. "Play like one god, I play like zwei gods, and they do nothings." 13. A sudden cure. He who undertakes to manage an opera troupe chooses a road beset by thorns. Opera singers, especially if their salaries be high and they feel they can afford to follow their own sweet wills, generally do about the exact opposite of what a sensible person would predict. The manager must be ready for any emergency, and be surprised at nothing. Some years ago, when Madame Gerster was billed to sing in St. Louis, she suddenly sent word to the manager that she was ill and unable to sing her part in Lucia, which must be given that evening. He suspected the indisposition to be not very serious, but requested a medical certificate to put before the public to satisfy them for the non-appearance of the songstress. Gerster declined to be seen by a physician, saying her word was as good as her bond, and that when she said she was ill, that settled it. The manager insisted upon calling in a physician, who asked to see her tongue. So, as she was leaving the room, she derisively stuck out her tongue at him, with the exclamation, "There!" The doctor at once wrote out a certificate, saying that the epiglottis was irritated, the uvula contracted, and the tonsils inflamed. When Gerster was shown this certificate, she grew quite angry and insisted upon singing that night, just to show what an ass that doctor was. All the same, the doctor sent in his bill for $60. 14. Ole Bull at Rouge et Noir. Ole Bull first visited Paris in 1831. He was then 21 years of age, and had left his native country to make his journey to the French capital on foot, feeling that he must get a hearing, if possible, in some of the musical centers if he was to be successful in his musical life. He arrived tired, with little money and no letters of introduction. In a few days his clothes and his violin were stolen. In his despair he was ready to seek relief in the Seine. And had it not been for a chance acquaintance who suggested a plan by which he might better his fortunes, he might have come to the same end which has overtaken so many discouraged artists in Paris. The stranger, who turned out to be Vidocq, the great detective, directed Ole to go to a gambling establishment where they played rouge et noir, and to continually place his money on the rouge. The young fellow did so, placing his last francs on the red. He won. He played again. Again he was winner. And he continued until a large sum of money was before him. Fearing to lose what he had won, he retired from the table and watched the play for a few moments, just long enough to see that, had he continued playing the red, he would have won a fortune. But though he was on the verge of starvation, the money thus obtained was not without its sting. He wrote a friend, "What a hideous joy I felt! What a horrible pleasure it was to have saved one's own soul by the spoil of others." The young Norwegian soon purchased another violin, and being invited to play at a private concert, succeeded in attracting attention to himself in spite of the fact that all Paris was then worshipping Paganini. 15. Outspoken admiration. Here is a case of admiration of one artist for another that deserves mention. When the English musician Rosengrave was in Italy at an evening company, a quiet and unassuming young man who was present was asked to play. When he began, writes Rosengrave, I thought 100 devils were at the instrument, for never had I heard such passages and effects before. So far did he surpass my own playing, that had I but had a knife within my reach, I would have cut off my fingers. So ashamed was I that I declare I could not touch an instrument for a month afterward. The quiet young Italian was Scarlatti, the celebrated Italian composer and performer. End of section 3.
Section 4 of Anecdotes of Great Musicians, read by Gillian Hendry. Anecdotes of Great Musicians by Willey Francis Gates. 16. Whims of Composers. Composers get peculiar ideas into their heads as to the circumstances under which they must work, or the surroundings that must be at hand if they are to get the best results in composition. No doubt, after the habit is once formed, the regular accompaniments to composition are necessary, but the question is as to the necessity of forming the habit. Haydn thought he could not compose unless he had on the ring which Frederick the Great sent him, and besides this, the paper on which he wrote must be white and of the best quality. Gluck wrote best when seated out in the middle of a field. Rossini was most productive of good music when lined within with good sack wine, and he and Paisiello both enjoyed composing while in bed. Sacchini enjoyed having a pretty woman by his side. By the way, several of the great composers had no aversion to such an accompaniment, whether composing or not. And his pet cats must be playing around him. Mozart could compose beautiful music while playing billiards or bowls. Zingarelli prepared himself for writing music by reading the scriptures or some classic author, and Sarti liked best a funereal gloom, lighted only by a single taper. Beethoven could compose best during or after a brisk walk in the woods and fields, and many of his greatest works were inspired by the beauties of nature. Cimarosa and Méhul were opposites in this matter. The former wished to be surrounded by a dozen gabbling friends. The light conversation and flow of spirits, probably of two kinds, seemed to inspire his music. On the other hand, Méhul once went to the chief of police of Paris and asked to be imprisoned in the Bastille. That personage, in surprise, inquired the reason. Méhul said he desired to get away from the noise and bustle of the city, and to escape from the good graces of his friends for a time, that he might give his whole mind uninterruptedly to composition. It is needless to say that his wish was not granted. Few would wish to be surrounded by the walls of the Bastille unless it were to write a tragic overture or a funeral anthem. Wagner thought he must be clothed in the costume of the age and place in which was laid the plot that he was then working on. He also desired a perfectly quiet and uninterrupted time in which to write. His family was denied admission to his study, and he would not even see any letters that came for him. His mails were passed in to him through a trapdoor. 17. Au le boule as a duellist. Handel was not the only great musician to fight a duel, although he was the greatest composer who took a part in that exciting pastime. Au le boule once had an adventure similar to Handel's, but from all accounts the Norwegian violinist must have been a better swordsman than the dear Saxon. In his student days in Germany, Boule once fell in with a party of carousing students, and was persuaded by them to take the part of their violinist, who had become more than half seas over, in a concert they were about to give. He accepted the position, and played so well that the drunken fiddler whom he succeeded was jealous of his success, and challenged him to a duel. Now, Ole could handle a sword as well as a fiddle bow, and soon had disabled his opponent. This made things so warm for him in that neighbourhood that he had to take his departure to Norway. 18. He didn't purchase. Perfect command of one's instrument does not necessarily imply complete control of one's tongue. This was the case with Lindley, an English cellist of the first half of this century. Though he gained great fame as a player, he never succeeded in controlling the unruly member. It would stutter in spite of him. One day, in his rambles through the streets of London, he came across a shop where there was a parrot hung up for sale in the window. He and his friends were quite interested in the bird, and finally Lindley called out the shopkeeper, saying, as he pointed to the Polly, "Can't he talk?" "Yes," was the answer from the dealer, who thought he could see that it was mere curiosity that prompted the question, and not a desire to purchase. "Yes, and a d sight better than you can, or I'd wring his blanked neck." 19. A critical composition. Musical progress depended largely at one time on the effect produced by one composition. It came about in this way. In the middle of the 16th century, the music used in the Mass of the Catholic Church had become so light and trivial that Pope Marcellus concluded he would discontinue the use of music in the service. But the great composer of that day, Palestrina, who, by the way, was generally known by the name of his native place, believing that could the Pope and Cardinals hear a Mass written in what he believed to be the true ecclesiastical style, they would reverse their decision, begged them not to put the order into execution until they had given his music a hearing. The request was granted, and on Easter 1555, this Mass, called Missa Papae Marcelli, that is, Mass of Pope Marcellus, was performed before the highest dignitaries of the Church. It was an entire change from the trivial church music of the time. So refined, elevating, and appropriate was it to the sacred office for which it was intended, that the Pope and Cardinals were delighted, and had no further thought of banishing music from the service. Another result was that Palestrina was appointed chapel master to the Pope, and exercised a most beneficial influence in church and other styles of composition for many years. He is now regarded as a landmark in musical history, and when we remember that the Catholic Church was in those times the main conservator of musical art, we realize that, even at this day, we owe him a debt of gratitude. 20. Keep in with the accompanist. It is good policy for a singer to keep on the good side of his accompanist. A really fine accompanist is a rara avis. Besides the technical skill necessary to a soloist, an accompanist must have the finest musical feeling and discrimination, and at the same time sacrifice himself to the interests of the singer. And oftentimes the accompanist has to shoulder the sins of the singer. It is an easy way to relieve oneself from the blame of a bad break by charging the fault to the accompanist. A singer once tried this with Handel, and declared that if Handel didn't accompany him better, he should jump over onto the harpsichord where the player sat and smash it. Said Handel, "Let me know when you will do that, and I will advertise it. I am sure more people will come to see you jump as will come to hear you sing." He didn't jump. End of section 4.
Section 5 of Anecdotes of Great Musicians. Anecdotes of Great Musicians by Willey Francis Gates. The youthful Beethoven's trick on a singer. Another incident of the necessity of a good understanding with the accompanist is found in the life of Beethoven. He, as a mere boy, held the responsible position of organist in the Electoral Chapel at Bonn. In the choir was a smart singer who declared he could sing anything, and no accompanist could disconcert him. Beethoven made a wager with him that he could succeed in putting him out. So, in a service in Holy Week, by an adroit modulation in his accompaniment of this coxcomb, the latter was handed in a key where all he could do was to break down. The singer at once complained to the elector, who heard the case and reprimanded them both. But we can hardly blame Beethoven. For a boy of 15, Beethoven's age at that time could hardly withstand the temptation to try his skill under such provocation. An untalented royal pupil. Louis XII was endowed with more love for music than talent or voice for singing. On his attempting to sing, it was only courtesy or policy that caused the unfortunates who happened to be present to remain. In his attempts to read music, he succeeded no better. At last, in despair of singing the ordinary music of the day, he ordered the conductor of his chapel music, the maître d' des chapelles, Josquin by name, to write a piece of music that he could succeed in singing. So, in a few days, the king was presented with a piece for 4 voices, 2 of which were in canon form. The other 2 accompanied, simply furnishing the harmony. Of these latter voices, the upper had but 1 pitch to sing throughout the whole piece, and the lower but 2, the tonic and dominant, sung alternately. After careful drill, the king was able to take his, the upper part, and later acquired sufficient skill to sing the lower part with tolerable accuracy. This may illustrate to the non-musical public one, at least, of the difficulties that beset the path of a singing teacher. For some people that the Lord never intended to sing will persist in singing and are not content to sing music fitted to their capacity. Handel's persuasiveness. There was a day when players and singers so ruled directors and composers that the latter hardly knew whether they could call their lives their own. But that day is past, and Handel was one who prominently assisted in bringing about the new order of things. 2 instances will serve to show how he controlled his unruly singers. When Caristini was given the beautiful aria Verde Prati in Alcina, he sent it back to Handel, saying it was too trivial for him to sing in public. Handel rushed off to the singers' rooms and, foaming with rage, yelled to the astonished Italian, "You tog! Don't I know better as yourself what is best for you to sing? If you do not sing all the song that I gives you, I will not pay you ein stiver." Nor could this choleric composer be bullied by the weaker sex. At a rehearsal of one of his operas, the great soprano, Cuzzoni, gave him great trouble by her impudence. Finally, she refused to sing a certain aria. Handel concluded the time had come to see who was master. So he rushed onto the stage, and catching the astonished prima donna around the waist, he dragged her to an open window, crying, "I always knew you was a very Teufel, but I will show you I am Beelzebub, the prince of the Teufels." Then he threatened to throw her out headlong unless she promised to sing the song. Cuzzoni was frightened half to death and begged to be released, promising to do anything he might require. Good English in song. In the eyes of many singers, and in the minds of much of the public, the words used when singing are of no particular value. This may be true of a goodly number of popular songs that live for a day, but in the strictest sense of the word, and speaking of good music, the mission of the music is to give the sentiment a proper setting. A perverted idea has, with one class of opera and songwriters, brought music to the place of prime importance. It is true, but this is an unnatural arrangement of things. Music, as separate from all else, has its true place in the instrumental field. When words are set to music, they should be good enough to merit a hearing. And the singer who slights his words and leaves you in doubt as to the language he happened to be using is just that far from being a finished singer. It is claimed that English is a hard language to sing. So it is for those that will not give it the necessary study and practice. It is likewise claimed that Italian is easy to sing. So it is for an Italian. But an Italian might be as much in doubt about the American student's Italian words as the American auditor is forced to be concerning the student's English words. It is well known that many a singer covers her inability to sing distinct English by a retreat into poor Italian, which she thinks will be Greek, if not Italian, to her audience. Vocal teachers are coming to realize that the highest vocal art requires one to sing their own language perfectly, and that years of practice in mongrel Italian do not give ability to sing good English. The reason for this is that there are many difficult consonant and vowel combinations appearing frequently in the English that are unknown to the Italian. That German or Italian are not good preparations for English singing is shown by the remarkable combinations of sounds that foreign singers will use when called on to sing an English song. This is all right if we follow the doctrine that words are of no importance, but that doctrine does not obtain among artists. Why should we have to listen to that grand solo from the Messiah, tortured into "Sie Kings hof sie hört ries Hoop"? Who could be expected to know from hearing this sort of continental English that the kings of the earth rise up? Then, when some celebrated Italian prima donna is called on to sing our national hymn, how patriotic we must feel to hear "Mi concretis uf die, sweat landa of liberta, uf die sing, landa ver mi fa ters dida, landa uf die pilgrims prida, froma I frei montin sida, letta fritom ring." An uncringing reply. Queen Elizabeth is sometimes pictured as possessed of a temper which, carrying with it the power of revenge, made it greatly feared. The Virgin Queen is also reported by some writers to have been a proficient musician. Probably both statements are true. Although it was hardly safe to speak of her temper during her life, it was the proper thing to flatter her musical attainments. One of her desires was to excel Mary, Queen of Scots, as a performer. But Elizabeth's temper did not always cause her to wreak vengeance on those who spoke in an unbecoming manner to the Queen. This is instanced in the case of Dr. Tye, who frequently performed on the organ in the royal chapel. On one occasion, while he was playing some music more scientific than tuneful, she sent the verger to him with the message that he was playing out of tune. The doctor's quick reply was, "Tell the Queen that her ears are out of tune." The Queen let that remark pass without rebuke. End of section 5, read by Bookbard.
Section 6 of Anecdotes of Great Musicians, read by Matea Bracic. Anecdotes of Great Musicians by Willey Francis Gates. 26. Southern Passion. We of the northern nations often think of the mock tragedies of the operatic stage as being overdrawn and untrue to the life. Such incidents and plots are often said to be exaggerated and of the blood and thunder stagey sort. But we must remember that blood flows much more rapidly through southern veins than through northern, and that we, with our cold, calculating way of looking at things, do not take into consideration the fiery temperament of the southern climes that make such plots but representative of the real passions of the Italian and Spanish nations. The plots of the Mascagni and Leoncavallo school may not be elevating or over-refined, but they undoubtedly do picture one phase of life. This is not saying, however, that it is well to dwell on that phase, or that it has in it much that can ennoble the listener. Passion and pain and the lower emotions need not be continually served up to the opera-goer simply because the method of representing them is artistic. There is enough that is good and beautiful in the world, out of which to make our operatic plots without descending to the slime and filth of life, however artistically it may be dressed up. But the other, the lower side, exists not only in opera plots, but in the real life. The little incident here given, if presented on the stage, would be classed as a mere bit of melodramatic Italian opera. Yet it is one of many such things that continually happen. Leonardo Vinci was one of the numerous talented composers of the old school. In the midst of his successful career at Rome, he made the acquaintance of a noble Italian lady who was possessed of great beauty and who conceived quite a passion for this distinguished musician. The admiration was mutual. All went well until the lady granted the composer some particular favours, and he, with an absence of discretion unusual to musician, boasted to his friends of his good fortune in securing the lady's regard. His words coming to the ears of the fair damsel, and disliking to have her private affairs made public talk, she would never have made a modern opera songstress, she determined to be revenged for his gossiping about her, and gave him his quietus, not with a bare bodkin, but in a cup of poisoned chocolate. This summary method will doubtless commend itself to all who suffer from indiscreet friends. 27. Rather a hard opponent to conquer. It is not always safe to deride one whose abilities seem to be less than our own. This lesson was painfully learned by a young violinist of Berlin at an evening party to which he had been invited. He played several pieces, not with great applause, however. Afterwards, another young man was invited to play, but his playing was worse than that of his predecessor. In fact, his style and execution were wretched. So our young professor again came forward and showed his superior abilities in a very pretentious way, as if to utterly crush the strange musician. But when it again became the stranger's turn to play, his performance was given with such expression and brilliancy of execution as to utterly vanquish the young upstart, who disappeared and was seen no more that evening. He had been contending with Paganini. 28. Catalani and Goethe. Angelica Catalani was a singer who held sway in Europe for 30 years in the last century as the peer of all prime donne. It has been said that never has the public been so carried away by the voice of any songstress as by hers. One writer calls her the Paganini of song, and from the accounts that have come down to us of her flights of vocalization, the title must have been well bestowed. Going on to the stage at the age of 16, this musically gifted person was ignorant in all matters but her art, and besides this she was of an excitable temperament, vivacious and talkative. Her ignorance of people and things often led her into making amusing blunders. One writer relates a ludicrous scene which took place between her and the great poet Goethe. They were at Weimar, and at a court dinner she was seated next to Goethe, who was the most distinguished guest. Goethe and his works were utterly unknown to her, but seeing that he seemed to be a man of consequence and that much attention was paid to him, she inquired of the gentleman on the other side of her who this personage was. Thereupon the following conversation took place. "He is the celebrated Goethe, madam." "Oh, he is! And on what instrument does he play?" "He is not a musician, madam. He is the celebrated author of Werther." "Oh, yes, I remember." Then turning to the venerable poet, she declared, "Ah, sir, what an admirer I am of Werther." The poet bowed low in acknowledgment of the compliment. "I never," continued she, "read anything half so laughable in all my life. What a farce it is, to be sure!" Goethe looked aghast at this remark, but managed to exclaim, "The sorrows of Werther a farce, madam?" "Oh, yes, there never was anything so exquisitely ridiculous," declared the talkative lady, laughing heartily at the remembrance. It was found out afterwards that she had once seen in Paris a parody on Goethe's Werther, which had ridiculed the original most unmercifully, but parody and original were all the same to her. 29. The music, but not the face. While the great composers have, as a general thing, had remarkably retentive memories for musical matters, some of them were not so good at remembering other things. Rossini was one of these. He had a remarkably poor memory for names, but could remember faces. On one occasion he met Bishop, the English composer, and, recognizing him, started to greet him with, "Oh, my dear Mr. But he could get no farther. The name was gone. But to show Bishop that he remembered the man, if not the name, he began to whistle Bishop's chorus, "When the Wind Blows." This was a compliment that the English Mozart, as Bishop has been called, was not slow to recognize. 30. A concert preacher. Hans von Bülow was considered by the political authorities of Berlin and Leipzig as a great nuisance as well as a great musician. This arose from the fact that he persisted in interpolating in the speeches he frequently made at his concerts remarks of a political nature, and often they were of a decided incendiary cast. In the latter city, this concert preacher, as he was called, was compelled by the police to sign a promise not to speak a word at his concerts, not even to announce the date of his next appearance. And this was not 200 years ago either, as one might suppose from the denial of the right of speech, but was in our own times, in a supposable free country. But it was in Berlin that he had a still greater difficulty with the powers that be. Having conceived a strong dislike for the government intendant, that official which had control of the operatic performances, who in this case happened to be Count von Hulsen, he referred to him in one of his impromptu concert speeches in a derogatory way, and to the opera as "the circus that von Hulsen runs." As von Hulsen was a court officer, this brought on Bülow's head the wrath of the court, and he was deposed from his rank as court pianist and stripped of his medals. Shortly after, von Hulsen died, and at a commemoration concert his successor gave orders to the ushers that they were not to admit Dr. von Bülow, and furnished them photographs of him that there should be no mistake. So when Herr Doctor arrived, he was spotted and summarily ejected. But the pianist had his revenge. The next night, on his appearance at a concert, when he sat down at the instrument, he began to improvise on a theme from Mozart's Figaro, and immediately the audience broke into laughter and applause. The theme he had chosen was in the opera, set to the words, "Will the Count venture on a little dance?" End of section 6.